Hello everyone. We are finally coming in for our next video. So for this week's topic, I wanted to go back to, as I said at the beginning of the year, being the 250th anniversary of the United States, we're going to probably try to cover a little bit more around the founding era and into the early republic of the United States, that up till about probably the 50-year anniversary of the United States in particular would be a golden period to look at. So about 1826, I think, would be when that was. And key one key topic that I have kind of skipped around on this channel upon review. I have talked about topics that mentioned this one but did not purely go into it. Was the Quasi War. And the Quasi War was not really well, it was and it wasn't. Quasi in itself is a word it's a word meaning almost. So this literally translates to almost war. The Almost War is pretty much what you can call it. And it was an undeclared naval conflict between the United States and, shockingly, it wasn't Britain. It was revolutionary France, our former ally that had helped us during the revolution. And the Quasi War was this instance where the United States and France pretty much were in a conflict, but neither one of them ever formally declared one. And it never really blossomed to a full scale conflict as it could have. So to understand a little bit, and mind you, this is about 1798 to 1800. So the United States has only been independent at this point for not even 20 years yet, officially, since officially we declared independence in 1776, but the Treaty of Paris that actually recognized American independence wasn't signed until September of 1783. So the country's not even 20 years old yet, and it's already at war with what had been its one major ally it had in Europe. And to understand how that came about, there's one key issue that comes about that brings all that about, and that is none other than the French Revolution. So to go back and recap a little bit, and I have covered this in a separate video, and I'll attach it to the end of this one in case anyone wants to go back and look at it. We had covered previously about, I think about a year ago, the relationship between France and the United States in the Revolutionary War and how France came to be America's first major ally and was a very big help and aid to the United States ended up winning the revolution. Had France not intervened, it is likely the United States may not have won. In 1778, the Kingdom of France became the first formal ally of the newborn United States. It sent economic and military assistance to the Americans. It sent all manner of support that it could. It was a full fledged military alliance. France officially recognized the United States as a sovereign power. It was eager to get in on the American Revolution as it saw more of an opportunity not so much to help the Americans, but more or less to humiliate Great Britain, who had defeated France just a couple of years before at the end of the Seven Years' War in 1763. So France kind of saw an opportunity to get payback against the British, who they had long held massive rivalries with. And this revolution in Britain's 13 colonies kind of provided France with the excuse to, oh, this is the perfect time to get payback. We can make them lose their colonies, and at the same time, we can become a friend to this new nation, which could be a beneficial trade partner. Now, the war would end, as we said, in 1783 with independence recognized for the US. Now, despite the war ending, France really didn't get much out of the American Revolution other than helping the United States get, its independence. It really didn't France did not get a huge amount of territory ceded to it by Great Britain. It did not get massive economic earnings from Great Britain. France more or less just got the gratitude of having humiliated Britain and getting the United States free. And while that might sound good on paper, it wasn't so much good for the French nation because even before the American Revolution, France's multiple wars that they had waged against Britain during the course of the 18th and 17th centuries had finally started to rack up quite the national debt. France was an absolute, chaos in terms of its debt. It had debt that was skyrocketing to the point the economy was seriously hindered by it, and the French economy was on the basis of collapse. French society was on the basis of collapse because of the poor economic conditions in France. And then France decided while it was had this large national debt to go and fund a revolution that they were largely footing the bill for because America didn't have the money. So who has the money? The French do supposedly because they're a major European power, but in reality, they don't really. So France It really comes off on the bad side of the American Revolution because while it does accomplish its basic goal of humiliating Great Britain, it didn't get any key concessions of its own and is left with even worse debt than it had prior to getting involved, which would ultimately contribute to the outbreak of the French Revolution itself in 1789, which became when 1789, the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789 is what is contributed. It was what attributed to starting the French Revolution, and it was really a revolution that was ironically inspired by the success and the Enlightenment ideals of the American Revolution that France had just helped not even 10 years prior. And at first, the French Revolution wasn't all that bad. They had these virtues of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and there was a constitutional monarchy established that took away from the old ancient regime that had become so despised. The monarch was forced to share his power. The first 2 years weren't that bad. It wasn't until 1792 that it starts to take a turn. And in 1792, France gets rid of the monarchy completely. King Louis XVI is forced to abdicate his throne, and he is ousted. There are not going to be any more kings or queens in France. That's what they said, of course, but we know that's not true. And they decide to abolish the monarchy. In 1792, King Louis XVI loses his throne, and France becomes officially the first French Republic, modeled after the American Republic. So at first, as we said, it goes well. But shortly after the king is forced to abdicate, things start to change. Now, correlating with the small period where the revolution is going on, mildly, well and decent compared to what had come before, back in the United States, many Americans at first were very supportive of the events in France. They simply saw it as the continuation of the struggle against monarchical tyranny, and they saw this as simply a continuation of the struggle that they had fought 10 years before. Except now they were hoping, with France now falling and getting rid of its monarch and establishing a democratic republic based on Enlightenment virtues, that the other European nations would soon follow. The Americans often, at this time, back home here in the United States, many of us wore tricolor cockades like the French revolutionaries did in France, and political clubs of Democratic Republicans would often praise the French Jacobins' ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, as I said, once the revolution started to turn sour, public opinion here in the United States also started to turn. And that started shortly after the king abdicates. And in January of 1793, the new Jacobin government ends up deciding that King Louis XVI should be executed, and they decide to guillotine him. They take the thing where they slap you on the board and the blade comes down and cuts your head off. Everyone knows what that looks like, I think. So in January 1793, King Louis XVI gets his head chopped off by guillotine. And it is shortly after that that the Jacobin government not only stops at executing the former king, they go to the extent of starting to arrest and execute anybody that they suspect of counter-revolutionary activity, or in many cases, simply anti-Jacobin activity. They might have been very much pro-revolution, but didn't like what the Jacobin political organization was doing on its own, and that was enough to get them executed and slated for treason. By March of 1793, the French Republic was completely at war, as the Jacobins who were in power dreamed of becoming, they wanted to become bolder. They wanted to be much bolder than they had been. And they saw an opportunity to spread the revolution in France to across Europe and spread it beyond France's borders. So by March of 1793, the French Republic is at war with Spain, Prussia, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and Great Britain all at the same time, as these countries are now feeling threatened by the Jacobins' attempt to expend the French Revolution into their countries, and they see the chaos that has happened in France. They've seen the king executed. These are all monarchical countries, with the exception of the Dutch Republic, I believe. I don't think the Dutch Republic had a monarchy. But they feel threatened by the events in France. And of course, this leads to conflict. So again, France is at war with, among other nations, Great Britain. Now, as the French Revolution would escalate, French revolutionaries looked to the United States for support, considering that the 1778 Treaty of Alliance was still in effect. And they claimed that the U.S. was an ally. We had helped you during your time of need. Now we have need of your help. You should come help us. Many Americans at that time still considered France to be an ally, and Despite the growing bloodshed in France, they were more than willing to support France if it meant supporting a helpful ally that had helped them in the past. Thomas Jefferson himself actually remained committed to helping France, as he viewed Great Britain as a continued enemy of the United States, at one point, even famously quoting in response to the growing violence in France that was coming from the revolution. He was quoted as making the following statement of the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So Jefferson, even though he was very pro-French in a lot of ways in his life, he had been ambassador to France. He had been, he had been to France a lot. He loved French architecture, French cuisine. He brought a lot of that here to the United States and kind of introduced it. You can see it in his home that he built when he was in the White House. I believe he was the first president to ever have mac and cheese, which was originally something that he brought over from France, I think. That he had brought over. Ice cream, I think, was something that he started to I mean, it existed, but he really popularized it. Jefferson was a Francophile, to put it bluntly, and he didn't really care about the violence that was starting to ensue as the revolution started to turn sour. He just saw it as the natural extension of liberty being planted in a country that had not known it. In 1793, France would try to garner support in the United States. French ambassador Charles Edmond Genet would travel the country, riling up anti British sentiment within the US and speaking at Democratic Republican societies in the hopes of getting the US public to publicly urge their government officials to get the United States involved in the war on the side of France, revolutionary France. He would even go so far as to start recruiting American privateers to attack British merchant vessels, which was a major escalation because the United States supposedly isn't helping France, but yet there's American privateers being hired by the French government to attack British shipping. How do you think Britain's going to look at that? And from what their point of view, the United States government may not have ordered it, but they're not doing nothing to stop it either. Now, despite the support of many Americans, there were others, like especially those in the ruling Federalist Party at the time, that did not support the French Revolution in any way. The Federalists were more of a nationalist party compared to the Democratic Republicans, and they were much more hostile to the French Revolution. Many of them, including their leader Alexander Hamilton, were actually Anglophiles and wanted closer ties with Great Britain, seeming that the United States and Great Britain had a shared cultural history and among other things, and that they should try to better relations between the two countries again after the revolution. And they were horrified. They were absolutely horrified by the chaotic radicalism in France that was just engulfing the country, and feared that if it was allowed to persist, it could eventually come to the United States. President Washington, who was president at this time, agreed with the Federalist concerns, and he wanted the US to distance itself from France. He did not want the US to become embroiled in another war because he knew very well that the United States was in no way prepared to go into another war. The Continental Army had been disbanded after the end of the American Revolution, so had the Continental Navy. The United States had almost no military force to speak of other than a small army that had been formed to combat Native Americans in the Northwest Territory during the Northwest Indian War. And it was nothing of the likes that had been there during the Revolution or any of the days before. So America is in no way ready to go into a conflict, and Washington doesn't really want to, even if he had the military, he doesn't think it's in the United States' best interest to go to war with Great Britain or any of these European powers, because he does correctly make the argument it is Europe's affair. And on top of that, the not so often spoken argument, we barely won the revolution. Do you really want to risk losing our independence because of some European quarrel? So instead, Washington would publicly denounce the actions of Ambassador Genet, and he would even refuse to meet with him. Genet would end up insulting Washington, and after Washington did this to him, only to later get asylum granted from him when he went back home and learned that he was basically being declared a counter-revolutionary and slated for execution, and thus he sought exile in the United States. And Washington, despite their harsh history with each other a little bit, decided to grant him asylum in the United States. The Washington would officially issue a proclamation of neutrality on April 22nd, 1793, officially announcing that the United States was neutral in the ongoing conflict between revolutionary France and the other European powers. Congress would also decide at the same time to suspend repayments of the French loans from the Revolution, claiming that since the loans were borrowed from the French monarchy, which no longer existed in France, Congress argued that they need not be paid to the new republic since they had not been the government that those loans had been lent from. Not exactly the most valid argument, but okay. Now, of course, the United States declaring neutrality and then stating that we're not going to repay our loans that we owe you from the revolution, that does outrage and anger the French Republic, and tensions would continue to build over the following year. The Federalists were very pro British, as we said. They wanted closer political and economic ties with Great Britain. And in 1795, Congress would ratify the very controversial Jay Treaty, which would foster trade between the United States and Great Britain and resolve several issues between the two countries that had been left unsettled since the end of the Revolution. France was absolutely incensed by the Jay Treaty of 1795, viewing it as an American British alliance and a betrayal of the 1778 Treaty of Alliance that Britain and France had, that not Britain and France, but America and France had had. As a response, the French government would start ordering French privateers to begin attacking neutral American shipping the following year in 1796, ordering that any American ship carrying British cargo was a valid prize of war. And within 1796 alone, almost 300 American ships ended up being captured, and their crews were often treated very poorly by the privateers that had boarded them. So this would come to change shortly after in terms of United States leadership. And that was on March 4th of 1797, President George Washington leaves office. He officially goes into his retirement after serving 2 terms in office. His successor, his former Vice President John Adams, is inaugurated on that day as the second president of the United States, with Thomas Jefferson, his political rival, being being inaugurated as his vice president. Because back then it was the second runner-up got VP, and the first place got president. There was no 12th Amendment back then. Adams, upon coming to office, is immediately presented with the problem, the escalated tensions between the United States and France. And on May 16th of 1797, Adams would announce to a special session of Congress that he, quote, that France had, quote, inflicted a wound in the American breast, and that he would try to heal the friendship between the two nations. He stated, we do want to restore relations with France. I think this is just a bad sort of misunderstanding. I do not think this is worth going to war. However, at the same time, he also asked Congress to start building up the military, which had been almost, as we said, non existent after the revolution, with small exceptions. That was a political powder keg because the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's political party, they are very much opposed to large standing armies. They had been since the end of the revolution. Many of these men had been because they viewed that large standing armies were the symbol, they're a symbol of monarchical governments, of autocratic governments, of tyranny. And peaceful democratic republic shouldn't have need of a large standing army when it is not officially at war. It can be turned into a tool for the government to oppress the people. And that was their view. So they view Adams's request to start building up the American military as something that is very dangerous. And Adams's counter to that is if we build up the American military, it would add some weight to any diplomatic talks that we take, as letting the French know that we are prepared to defend ourselves if necessary, and we can defend ourselves. In October of 1797, 3 American envoys ended up arriving at Adams's he sent the 3 American envoys to France, and they ended up arriving in Paris in October of that year. And they are sent to Paris to begin the talks with the French Foreign Minister Charles Talleyrand. Talleyrand would grant the 3 envoys only a 15-minute discussion meeting, of which he used pretty much the entire meeting to deride President Adams's previous speech for its perceived hostility to France. Talleyrand would afterward only deal with the envoys through his intermediaries and refused to meet with them himself afterward. So, other than the one time they met with him for 15 minutes, he refused to deal with them personally the rest of the time that they were in Paris. The intermediaries, who were only known in dispatches as X, Y, and Z, told the envoys that no further negotiations could take place without the United States paying a sweetener of $250,000, not to the government of France, but to Talleyrand personally. This They also stated that the French Republic would require a $10 million loan as compensation for President Adams's speech's insults for the speech that he gave that they viewed was hostile to France's interests. When the American envoys refused to pay the very obvious bribe that was being offered to them by, these X, Y, and Z intermediaries of Talleyrand, they instead hinted at through veiled threats that any nation not aiding France directly would be considered to be an enemy of France. So pretty much American envoys go over there to discuss, toning down tensions. And what does the French foreign minister do? He outright just pretty much says, I'm going to meet with you for 15 minutes. I'm going to belittle your president. Then I'm not going to talk to you anymore. You're going to deal with my intermediaries. And then while they're discussing with the intermediaries get to the point that they're demanding $250,000 and a $10 million loan to be able to get talks going again. Basically, a bribe that you're going to pay us money if you want to continue to talk. And the money wasn't even going to France. It was going, into the case of the $250,000, it was going to Talleyrand himself personally. So, due to this, the talks would end up breaking down by April of 1798, the envoys had left Paris and come back home. They had notified Adams started getting the dispatches from these envoys in March of 1798 about the what became known as the XYZ affair with these officials who pretty much were insulting the United States on a standing that it was a sovereign nation, but yet we're going to treat you like little children and we're going to try to bribe you in order to get what we want out of you. Adams would inform Congress that negotiations had failed between the United States and France, and he asked to begin arming naval ships and manufacturing weapons, which further incenses Democratic Republicans and Vice President Thomas Jefferson, who labeled the move as absolutely insane because, again, they didn't like the prospect of readying for a war when there was no war declared, and on top of that, they're also Francophiles, and somehow in their minds were still trying to justify what the French government was doing. Now, the American public, and they would support Adams once the affair was made public. When the affair was officially announced to the American public, many of the public was absolutely outraged and thought the United States had been insulted on the world stage. This was an insult to American diplomats. Adams would appoint Benjamin Stoddert as the first Secretary of the Navy, effectively reestablishing the Navy that had not existed since the end of the Revolution. Congress would also approve the use of force against French ships in American waters, and all treaties with France would be considered null and void, including the 1778 Treaty of Alliance. Adams would refrain, however, from asking for a declaration of war, despite the desire of many within his Federalist Party, including Alexander Hamilton, who absolutely were trying to edge him on into asking Congress to declare war. Congress by 1798, by the time this conflict really starts to reach its fever pitch, they had ordered 6 frigates constructed back in 1794 in order to deter pirates that the United States was facing in the Mediterranean. Now, by the time of 1798, 4 years down the road, when the Quasi War starts to come about, the only 3 of these ships, the Constitution, the Constellation, and the United States, were ready in that year in order to go into service, with the other 3 still being under construction. Congress would try to improve this by appropriating funds for the remaining 3 to be ready within 2 years by 1800. And they would also outfit the Navy with what we call subscription ships, which were privately funded by cities which were then adopted into the U.S. Navy, which of these, there were 5 frigates that were subscription ships and 4 sloops, along with the 3 frigates that the United States had actually constructed for itself. The U.S. also decided to copy France by hiring privateers to kind of get back at France in their own dirty work. 365 privateers would be hired, with most coming from New England, which was a strong Federalist stronghold and thus had absolutely no love of the French. The American privateers were tasked with attacking French trade, capturing and harassing French privateers, and liberating captured American merchant ships that were being threatened by French privateers. This would also allow the Navy's 3 frigates to safely escort merchant ships to the British West Indies, where the primary conflict was going on between these privateers was in the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the West Indies. Warships would also patrol known safe havens for French privateers, most notably ones like Guadeloupe. Now, while the Navy was receiving the most attention, the U.S. Army was also receiving a boost at this time because it is unknown if this is going to purely stay a naval conflict Or is France, if this does go into full scale war, will France try to invade the United States? And this is why the army starts to get a bit of improvement as well. George Washington is actually recalled out of retirement to lead as commander in chief of this new American army that is being strengthened, with Alexander Hamilton serving as his second in command. Now, Hamilton, he's a bit of a controversial figure here. He's pretty much the head of the Federalist Party, of Adams's party, and he very much wants sort of an American empire. He wants the United States to become like a major European power in terms of acquiring land and territory. And he sees this possible upcoming war as a perfect opportunity for the United States to do just that. Now, due to this, Hamilton, he had dreams of invading Spanish Florida and Louisiana, and these all became even more important to him because Spain ended up siding with France as this conflict is breaking out. And there's the fear that if it does develop into a full-scale war, Spain may get involved as well. And Spain does have large borders with the United States in Florida and at the time Spanish Louisiana on the west side of the Mississippi. So at that time, the United States is pretty much thinking, there's the possibility we could also be going into a war with France here if it comes to that. And Hamilton's thinking the same thing. So he draws up plans for military invasions of Florida and Louisiana in case that should happen. And then he tries to get Adams to actually listen to the plausibility of his plans, which Adams would listen, but it is later chronicled that Adams's response to that in terms of his thoughts in his own personal writings was he thought Hamilton spoke more like a fool than he had ever heard him any other man speak like a fool because he did not believe that it was absolutely necessary and that the man was kind of arguing for war when we should be trying to avoid. Hamilton would continue working with Adams's cabinet in order to secure military funding and develop the army that was taking shape. He would even end up taking pretty much senior command as a senior army officer upon Washington's death in December of 1799 as this conflict is going on. He would eventually leave in June of 1800, mostly due to the tensions between him and Adams that were forming over their differing political views, which was causing a split within their party itself. And that also kind of spun from the factor that Adams was more than willing to try to reopen negotiations with the French government, and Hamilton was absolutely opposed to it. Now, the first major naval engagement that would occur in this quasi war, of which it is mostly a naval conflict, and it wasn't really a whole lot of them, but there are some major ones that happened. And the first major significant one occurred on July 7th of 1798, on the very same day that Congress approved the action against the French ships in American waters. The USS Delaware, which was a merchant vessel being converted into a military sloop, met the French privateer La Croyable off New Jersey. Delaware ended up chasing and capturing the French privateer ship in what was a very stunning early victory for the Americans. On February 9th of 1799, roughly almost a year later, the 36-gun frigate USS Constellation would encounter the French frigate L'Insurgente off the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. The Insurgente tried to board, but Constellation was able to successfully move out of the way so that it could avoid such a maneuver and then proceeded to broadside the French privateer, which caused it to end up surrendering and being captured. At the time, the Insurgente was what was considered to be one of the fastest ships in the French Navy. Now, Constellation would end up encountering another freighter, the La Vengeance, off the island of St. Kitts, roughly another year later on February 1st of 1800. It would engage the La Vengeance for 5 hours until darkness came and forced the two ships to break off. And despite having beaten the Vengeance, Constellation was too damaged to even try to pursue it, and so in the dark of night, La Vengeance, despite being weakened to the point it could have been captured, Constellation was in no condition to go after it, and it was able to escape and sail off into the night to escape to fight another day. So, as the naval war is ramping up in 1798 and 1799, going into 1800, President Adams is hoping that he can still avoid a major war between the United States and France, despite the growing number of ship engagements that are starting to occur. He would announce in October of 1799 that he would send another delegation to Paris to try to negotiate a successful conclusion to this little conflict that's broke out. Hamilton opposed Adams's move, claiming that Britain would soon win the war against revolutionary France and that the United States should stay involved in order to be seen as being on the winning side. Adams would end up sending a delegation anyway, which ended up splitting the Federalist Party over those who backed Hamilton and his stance that, we shouldn't be negotiating peace with the French, we should be pursuing this until Britain beats them, and those on Adams's side who wanted to avoid a war, and they're arguing we can't afford, to take that chance, we need to end it now, which would contribute to their loss in the election of 1800. Now, a new government by this point had now come. By the time the envoys of this delegation ended up arriving in France, of the second delegation that Adams sends, there was a new government in power in France, which had effectively ended the French Revolution. And that had come to power in November of 1789 when a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte ended up, oh, yes, that very same Napoleon, ended up coming to power in a coup against the French government and naming himself first consul. So at this point, France is entering the Napoleonic era. Napoleon is in power. He's not yet declared himself emperor, but he has officially gained most of the political power in France. And Bonaparte, he ends up wanting to restore relations with the United States, partly to stabilize the trade in the West Indies, which was vital to the French economy at this point, and to prepare for future conflicts that he knew was probably going to end up happening in Europe when he tried to expend the French Revolution further and tried to build his own empire, which eventually did happen. That's why we had the Napoleonic Wars. So officially, there would be negotiations that would open up in 1800, and it would ultimately culminate in what is called the Convention of 1800, or as we often call it, the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which was signed on September 30th of 1800, which officially would end the Quasi War, even though it was never really a full-on war. So what the Treaty of Mortefontaine did, or the Convention of 1800, was it would cancel the 1778 Treaty of Alliance that had bound France and the United States to ally since the Revolution. That is null and void. That is no longer a binding treaty. It would also reopen trade between the United States and France, trying to reopen that vital economic link between the two countries. It would also officially end all hostilities between the two nations at sea. And the one bad spot of it, though, that did cause some issues, especially for Adams in his reelection year, was that there was no compensation in this whatsoever from the French for American merchants who had lost merchandise and ships during this undeclared naval war. There would be no compensation for any of the American merchants who had lost cargo or merchandise or ships on their own. And because of that, many merchants in America were quite rightly upset that the Adams administration had seemingly forgotten about them and not, pled their case during these negotiations. And that may have been another contributor as to why Thomas Jefferson ended up coming into the presidency by beating Adams in 1800 when Adams tried to run for re-election. The Quasi War officially ended in 1800. Officially, that was when the close of hostilities were, and the most lasting impact of it, other than this brief little conflict history that we had with France, it leads to a permanent U.S. Navy. Where, as we mentioned, the U.S. Navy hadn't really existed since the end of the Revolution, when the Continental Navy was disbanded, and the Navy that would be reestablished during the Quasi War is still in existence. I think today, I still believe the United States' Navy is still the most powerful Navy on the planet. I don't think China's quite surpassed us yet, but we are still have the world's largest and most powerful Navy, and it has been around in some kind of a permanent fashion since the Quasi War, since President Adams went for rebuilding the United States Navy to counter the threat of French naval ships and privateers off the American coast. And one of those ships, the Constellation, not the Constellation, but the Constitution, one of those six original frigates, and the Constitution was one of the ones that did see action in the Quasi War, is actually still in existence, and it's still up in Boston Harbor where you can go see it, and it is still a commissioned naval vessel. It is the world's oldest still naval vessel still in service. It is officially docked in Boston. It's not obviously being used to patrol the world or guard anything, but it still has the honorific status of being commissioned by the U.S. Navy, despite the fact it's pretty much a museum ship nowadays. But you can actually go see it up in Boston Harbor. So that I think concludes for this video. Not the longest topic, but one that I did feel would be interesting to go over because we commonly don't really think we ever went to war with France, but we almost did. And it's a little episode that I think, as I said, I've kind of skipped around it on other topics, but I've never fully went at it on its own. And it's something that is quite interesting to kind of take a look at because it does establish a permanent navy for us and also explains, going into the War of 1812 era, why we weren't so on conflict basis with the French by that point, and it was more turning toward the British because we had kind of wrapped things up with the French before it got to a war. Where Britain, we weren't so lucky. Britain, we unfortunately did go to war a second time. So that will conclude for this video. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, or any added information, feel free to put it in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to look through it when I get the opportunity to do so. If anyone has any suggestions, do the same as well. As for our next video, I'm trying to think. I don't know exactly what it'll be at this point, so I guess we'll figure it out when it comes time. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next time for the next video.